Baylor this Saturday afternoon at McLean Stadium. Iowa State kind of righting the ship after playing a very intense game, not just a rivalry, but two top-ranked teams in Iowa, or top 10 teams in Iowa and Iowa State. There has been a little bit of bad blood at times between Iowa State and Baylor, and they play this Saturday in Travis Hines' Des Moines Register, and joins us on Sikkim 365 Radio. Travis, doesn't it seem to you that this has got a little bit of something to it? This Iowa State-Baylor, like we thought, this is our opinion, that a couple of years ago in 19, there was a lot of anger, and I get it because of how that game ended, but that it was supposed to be Iowa State's year to kind of move up to the next notch like it was last year or even this year, and that Baylor got in the way. Do you sense kind of a negativity between these two?
Yeah, I mean, I think you go back, what would have been 2018, David Montgomery, Iowa State star running back, gets thrown out of a game against Baylor at Jack Trice Stadium for fighting with Baylor. And then last year, the big talker, I think it got overblown, but you know how these things go with college football, that Iowa State wasn't allowed to have, or in 2019, wasn't allowed to have the tents on the sideline when it was 124 degrees. So yeah, I do think there's some animosity there. Obviously different coaching staffs at this point, but I do think that there is a little bit of juice to this matchup. And some of it is, I think as Baylor has maybe come down from the pack a little bit since the Briles years, that Iowa State and Baylor are kind of fighting for the same spot in the Big 12. And that's certainly going to even be more the case with Oklahoma and Texas leaving, that, they're kind of in that same real estate where if one advances, it's probably at the expense of the other. So I do think there is a little bit of juice to this thing.
What are we to believe about their offense? Is it the struggle bus that we saw in the first 2 weeks, or is it maybe a little bit of what we saw against obviously a lesser opponent in UNLV?
It's hard to say, because I do think when you're talking about, even at the FCS level, Northern Iowa always has a difficult, tough-nosed defense. Obviously, I think Iowa might have one of the stouter defenses in the country, and then you go to UNLV, which honestly just had no chance to stop Iowa State. I don't think they'd stop very many Big 12 offenses. So it's really difficult to say, but I think the default is you have a fourth-year quarterback in Brock Purdy, when you've got All-Americans at running back and tight end like Iowa State does, and then an all-league guy at wide receiver in Xavier Hutchinson. I tend to default to think that the offense will be fine. There's too much talent there for them not to figure it out, but certainly those first 2 weeks were concerning. So they might not be where they need to be, but I tend to lean on talent, and I don't think there's any question when you look at the track record of the players that Iowa State has on their roster that there's plenty of talent on that offense. It's just finding a way to make it work.
Did Brock Purdy's performance last week kind of quiet some of that chatter that had occurred as a result of the benching against Iowa?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know that there was any serious discussion among observers or Iowa State fans about actually benching Brock Purdy going forward. But when that happens in the fourth quarter of a game that you're probably not winning, but it's not fully out of reach, that's going to send the chatter pretty high. But then he had kind of a vintage Brock Purdy game against UNLV, super efficient, no mistakes other than a fumble that was a little fluky. But I do think that has quieted whatever misgivings there were. And the bottom line is that when Brock Purdy plays his best, he's one of the better quarterbacks in the Big 12. He's not incredibly flashy, but he is incredibly productive. And when you have an Iowa State team with a running back like Breece Hall in the backfield and a defense that is frankly incredible on the other end of the ball, you just need a quarterback to be efficient and mistake-free. And then when Brock Purdy's at his best, that's what he does. And when he struggles, it's throwing 3 interceptions against Baylor last year. It's throwing 3 interceptions against Iowa a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that first half last year, early in that game last year, that game was about the tilt. They were almost – Iowa State pretty much – golly, at halftime it looked like they were dead in the water, and then things changed. There was a long kick return, and then, obviously some things happened. What would it do, Travis? I mean, the season continues. You got a game next week or whenever the next game is. What would it do with all of the buildup they have, which is also expectations? That's the standard they want. If they don't push through this year and get to whatever that next level is supposed to be?
I think it'll be really hurtful, because you look at the roster and obviously everything's in flux because of, the eligibility questions, or will guys use that 5th and 6th year because of COVID last year. But I think if you're a betting man, you look at a lot of their stars are probably going to be moving on. This is as good as Iowa State has literally ever been positioned to have a successful season in 130 years of football. Are you going to bet that that's going to happen again in the next 3 to 5 years? Maybe. I think Iowa State's recruiting has been fantastic, but you're not going to have this collection of players at best for a few years. And then the other big looming question is, as was reported this summer, Matt Campbell got an offer of over $60 million from the NFL. At what point do you continue to turn that down if you're Matt Campbell? And if he's no longer able to turn down that insane amount of money, is there another coach that could replicate what he's done? Because again, in 130 years of football at Iowa State, he's the only one who has done what he's done here in the last 6 seasons. So I do think there's some urgency to make the most of this season. Although, again, there is optimism because you look at the game last week, they had 13 first or second year players play in that game. And I think they're really excited about their recruiting. It's just, again, when you've been waiting this long for this opportunity, it's really difficult if you come up short.
Travis, does it kind of maybe hurt the psyche of the Iowa State fans that they look across the state to their big in-state rival and their coach has been there? I mean, they've only had 2 coaches in like 78 years, it feels like, at Iowa with Hayden Fry and Kirk Ferentz. And, they've been this revolving door. I mean, do they wonder if there's some sort of magic elixir they could give Matt Campbell to make him completely content and ignore those riches?
Oh, man, I think we need to have like a multiple week-long show to really break down the relationship between Iowa and Iowa State fans in the last few decades, because it's incredibly complicated. There's jealousy on both sides, but certainly the Hawkeyes have dominated the discourse and the fandom in this state for decades, and that's certainly begun to change here in the last even 5 to 10 years. I think Paul Rhodes had a lot to do with that. While his tenure certainly fizzled at the end, he generated a lot of excitement that I think has helped build Iowa State to where it is now. But I mean, again, like you said, Hayden Fry and Kirk Ferentz for the last literally 40 plus years have turned Iowa into one of the more consistent programs, outside the absolute blue chips. And I think that's hard for Iowa State fans who have kind of ridden the roller coaster here, for decades to watch unfold just 130 miles away. But, if anything gives Iowa State fans solace or, can give them some confidence that maybe something like that could happen here, it's that Kirk Ferentz, very similarly early in his tenure at Iowa, had opportunities in the NFL that he ultimately turned down and has now turned Iowa into a program that, every 5 years they seem to have a special season. So if you're Iowa State and that's the opportunity or that's the blueprint that you see across the state, it's a pretty good one to replicate. And I do think there are a lot of similarities between Matt Campbell and Kirk Ferentz in terms of temperament, in terms of philosophy. We'll see in terms of career path.
Travis, what has been the feeling around Ames when it comes to all hell breaking loose following Big 12 media days with OU in Texas, and then subsequently, obviously a couple weeks ago, the official announcement of 4 new members to the Big 12 in the coming years. Obviously, a lot of uncertainty over the last few weeks. I know a lot of Iowa State fans are talking about, can we go to the Big 10? Or can we, what's kind of been the consensus on what's unfolded with the realignment in the Big 12?
I think the initial reaction was frustration from Iowa State, not because of the existential threat to the athletic department in the Big 12, but because they had a top 10 team for their first time in their history. And obviously realignment drove the discourse. Nobody was really talking about football there for 5 or 6 weeks as this unfolded. And I think that was frustrating for Iowa State fans who wanted to bask in this opportunity that they've had. And then I think it kind of got put on the back burner a little bit because there was so much uncertainty. I think there was maybe a little burst of optimism very momentarily about a potential landing spot in the Big 10. However, low probability that probably was in all likelihood. But I think now with the 4 coming in, there's at least a little bit of stability. And I think Iowa State fans are confident in their leadership in Jamie Pollard, who has now been the AD here, for 15 or 16 years. So I think there's a confidence level in how he'll navigate this for Iowa State and within the Big 12. But certainly, if you add those 4 programs in, and we'll see if they add more beyond that, you're still probably looking, in my opinion, at a pretty significant financial hit going forward. We'll see how it all unfolds. But, I think there is some consternation about, are you going to be able to support all of your non-revenue sports? Wrestling is a big deal. in the state of Iowa and at Iowa State? Are you going to be able to pay your football coach $4+ million a year like they're paying Matt Campbell? So I think those are the things where once all this settles, that'll be the concern spaces for Iowa State fans and for Iowa State administration.
Yeah, Travis, when this happened, when the Texas-Oklahoma story broke at the end of July, right after the Big 12 media days where everyone seemed to be so happy, kissy, wah-wah, and all of that, it wasn't the original, wouldn't you think Ames or Manhattan? I know, Lawrence, there was the immediate thought, well, we'll just go to the Big Ten. No, you're not. Slow down. Or everywhere else, wasn't it like, what happens to us? Wouldn't it be now where everyone's a little bit more comfortable, even though they're watching, so to speak, the college football stock market?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the Big Ten were to knock on the door tomorrow, Iowa State would go as fast as they could to that landing spot. But I think with what we've seen, I think initially when all that happened, people had flashbacks to 2010, where, honestly, Iowa State might be getting left without a chair in that game of musical chairs, where you're looking at the Mountain West. I know was the one that everyone was worried about, or initially when we weren't sure exactly how things were going to play out. Do you drop down to an AAC level where you're looking at $8 or $9 million a year from your TV rights as opposed to the 40 that the Big 12 is drawing in now? So I think those were the immediate fears. And once those got calmed a little bit, I think people are content with maybe not content, but understand that the Big 12 was dealt a pretty difficult hand, and they seem to be playing it as well as they can. Again, we'll see how it all shakes out at the end, but I think for the foreseeable future, the Big 12 feels relatively stable, and you're not looking at a potential financial catastrophe that you were looking at if everything dissolved and people are, looking for a spot to land, and you're looking at the Mountain West or the AAC where you're completely remaking your athletic department and probably your whole image as a program.
So, Travis, looking back to this Saturday, I mean, Iowa State is who they've been. We know the style, the physicality. We know the big playmakers on both sides of the ball, from Mike Rose and McDonald on defense to obviously Purdy and Kolar and, Breece Hall on offense, so on and so forth. This is a different Baylor team, though, than Iowa State has faced here recently. They're playing with a lot of confidence, actually showing some spirit on offense. What is the Iowa State perspective from either the fans or the media on what to expect from Baylor this weekend, or what to watch out for in regards to ISU?
Yeah, I think Iowa State fans and the coaching staff are certainly cognizant of the Baylor offense and their rushing attack. I think that's going to be the focus of their week. But I think really it'll come down to what is the matchup with the Iowa State offense and the Baylor defense. Because obviously Baylor's schedule has not been a murderer's row, and Iowa State's offense has struggled against the one Power 5 defense that it's played. So I think, we'll see maybe, which one of these is for real. Is the Baylor defense as good as it's stats? Is the Iowa State offense as bad as it's stats? So I think that'll really be where the game is won and lost. And I think one other thing to maybe keep an eye on is Iowa State's special teams have been a little shaky at times, not only this season, but going back to last season, where that's not a proven commodity yet. And if this is a close game, like we've seen a lot in this rivalry or in this series the last few years, that's a place where Iowa State has more confidence in its special teams this year than in previous years, but it's still unproven. So that's something to keep an eye on.
Thank you very much, Travis. Great to have you. Appreciate your time. And we'll know it. We play the games. We see the games. We watch the games and cover the games. We get evidence. And that's all that matters as we see what happens on Saturday. Travis, great stuff. The Des Moines, Iowa Register. He also writes for a newspaper in Ames as well and covers Iowa State very, very well. Joined us on Sikkim 365 Radio. We will have J.J. Joe in the early part of the next hour, former Baylor quarterback on Baylor Radio, on the development of Gary Bohannon again, and also the game on Saturday.
Yeah, I think this game's pretty cut and dry. I mean, I'm just curious to see it at this point. I mean, you know what you're getting from Iowa State. It's a matter of, how good will Brock Purdy be, but Breece Hall's going to get his. I mean, that's just going to happen, and it's a matter of how much you limit him to getting his. You got Hutchinson there. You got Kolar. You got Tariq Milton. I mean, there's some options in the passing game, although their passing game hasn't been great. Last week was the best showing that they've had. Their offensive line isn't totally dominant, especially in the passing game. So I'm very interested how Baylor will be able to handle, Breece Hall, handle containing Purdy, and then what Purdy's able to do, throwing the football. Now, if he doesn't have to and he can just afford to hand it off to Breece Hall more often than not, then that's not going to bode well for Baylor. But this is going to be a really interesting matchup. And they've been playing close games as of late. I mean, this isn't what I think people call a full-blown rivalry, but it's as close to being one as you can get without it being one, because there's definitely bad blood between these two fan bases. And, on the flip side, we know what we get with Iowa State. I mean, Will McDonald's a tremendous pass rusher. Mike Rose is Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. They've got studs all over the place, and they know their jobs and they know what they're doing, and they're just a machine on defense. And now to challenge that is this brand new Baylor offense with a brand new starting quarterback and a brand new offensive line and a brand new scheme. And